All right. Hello, everybody out there. So we have people joining. We will ask everybody, and we'll probably ask this a few times to sort of say a little something about yourself in chat, though I think we need to give everybody the ability to do that, so hang tight. Um, all right, you can all do that. So we'd ask everybody to sort of announce kind of where you're from if you're willing to share. Nevertheless, this is the third webinar and a webinar leading up to the Society for Applied Anthropology annual meeting in Albuquerque. And these are on AI. Again, the third session. There will be other events at the annual meeting. There are two workshops, two panels slash discussions, and then we also have webinars after. All of this is supported by an NSF grant. We'd encourage everybody to check out the previous two webinars that were recorded and posted to the Society for Applied Anthropology YouTube channel. Today, we are going to be building on those previous two and thinking about sort of what the future looks like for the field within an AI context. Official title is Imagining Anthropological Futures in AI. And so we're sort of building on themes from last time, particularly at the end of the last webinar, we were sort of talking a little bit about how the field needs to pivot and needs to update. And so today we will very much be kind of building on that. A few great speakers today, Kate Seek. I'll let everybody introduce themselves, but um, we have Kate, Sean Bruna, Kim Duran will all kind of represent a different perspective here. Kate is, these days very much in industry. Sean, I'm kind of making this up on your behalf, but I look at you as almost straddling the two. I think that's somewhat fair, but you could correct me if I'm wrong. And then Kieran, very much in the academic setting, and so we kind of have intentionally tried to get folks to represent sort of all those views. Um, but before we go too far, let's get maybe official introductions. Kate, you want to tell your story?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning for me, afternoon for some of you. My name is Kate Seek. I am a cultural anthropologist trained at Chicago and at Emory. And I lead a research team at Toyota Research Institute called the Department of Harmonious Communities. I've been there almost 5 years, and it is a mixed team of behavioral sciences, AI, and computer science HCI work. And our task was to really understand how we bring to life Toyota's global corporate mission of happiness for all. And so I work deeply embedded in teams that are building and designing AI platforms. Um, and really excited to be here today. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Sean.
Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here. I'm Sean Bruna. I'm a medical anthropologist. Someone recently told me that I have reinvented myself a couple different times over the years, and I'm still not sure what that means. But I started in many ways the academic track, and was trained at Chicago and University of New Mexico, and I went off to become a professor at a master's granting institution for many years. Um, Really wonderful work, and then changed contexts rather quickly. And I did some work in the previous administration at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, where I was a senior advisor, and really where I started to engage some of the topics really we're talking about today. Currently, I'm a staff scientist at the Medical University of South Carolina. I work primarily in the operating room setting, though I have various other projects, including many of which in the OR and outside, which engage in with AI in different ways. Today, though, however, I'll just be talking about my own experiences, my own thoughts, and as far as disclaimers go, the views that I'm talking about today are not necessarily of the institution I'm at or any of the other organizations that I'm affiliated with. But that said, I'm really thrilled to join this conversation with everyone today.
Thanks.
And good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are on planet Earth. My name is Kiran Jayaram. I'm an associate professor in anthropology at the University of South Florida, a cultural anthropologist, trained here, there, and everywhere, eventually ending up at Columbia University Teachers College in their applied anthropology program. My earlier work was on migration within the Caribbean, specifically Haiti and the Dominican Republic. looking at Haitian laborers and workers to the Dominican Republic. I'm sorry, laborers and students to the Dominican Republic. And then bounced around, did some work for the World Bank, and had tenure track positions at CUNY. And then before I came here, my uh, this fits into my larger current project, which is looking at the cultural dynamics of anthropological training globally. That's what I'm working on. And I've done work in India and the Dominican Republic and Haiti, and to some extent the US as well. And then since the advent of Gen AI, ChatGPT, and whatnot, this has been kind of like an important, sort of watershed moment. So that I've been upskilling and trying to meet the information flow as best I can in higher ed as a teacher, as a researcher. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks. And we should probably point out, Kieran and I are sort of leading this initiative. So if anybody has questions, reach out to either of us. Um, we'll obviously be at the conference, as will everybody here. So we look forward to connecting with folks there. So, Kieran, I'm actually going to stick with you. Even though I think arguably we know more anthropologists are working outside of the academy these days, when many people think of anthropology, they probably think of like more of like the academic discipline, which we know from other venues is heavily under threat. It was a big theme last year at SFA, kind of everywhere you went, right? It was being discussed. We and this has been building for many years, right? We know that we've lost funding. We know that programs are closing down or being drastically kind of retooled. And this was all before AI. This was sort of, this was just sort of a bigger trend, if you will. But uh, arguably, at least from my perspective, AI also puts, new pressures on the field. So considering, you study sort of education based out of there, tell us a little bit about what you're seeing, what pressures you think you're noticing or facing or that you're hearing about when you talk to folks.
Right. So, well, and I just like to just put a point on the fact that there are going to be three sessions at the SFAAs this year dealing with these sort of existential crises that are from the perspective of students. There's a student-led presidential session, and then there's a faculty presidential session, and then there's a practitioner non-academic session. So those are going to be, I think, very important discussions to continue what happened started last year. So yeah, I think the trends that I've seen it really is very simply put, you have those as far as faculty and students, those that are like, okay, let's use AI, whether officially or unofficially. Those who are kind of like, no way. And then those who are like, I just don't know. And they could be swayed either way or whatnot. Um, I've just read an article yesterday or in the past couple of days about how people are using AI for making college decisions. And which brings this other sort of level of like, how are students even getting to the universities, and how AI is affecting that. So, but then within this, in the classroom setting, before I switch to research, it, the basic point has dominated, I think, every department and person in departments that I've ever talked with has been, we're afraid that students are using AI to cheat. And how are we going to stop them from cheating? And then there becomes a little asterisk about ethical concerns and property rights, intellectual property rights. And then there's an asterisk about environmental impact, um, as justifications for why they may not want to embrace AI. And there's the idea that faculty have that students are being dumbed down by AI. And yet then there's a small group of people, not so much in anthropology, but elsewhere education, a lot of the, places that are being really reinforced, business, computer science, other places, they're doing a lot of ways to embrace AI and incorporate it into the curriculum. So what I kind of see is that, and although I've seen a little bit of this in There's skepticism in the arts and humanities and social sciences, the humanistic social sciences, for embracing AI, but there's some people who do. But that's what I've seen so far. As far as research, it's really I've read more about linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and biological anthropology embracing AI, not so much cultural anthropology.
Thanks.
Broad strokes.
Appreciate that. And so, Sean, kind of again, I'm viewing you almost as this sort of middle point. So I want to come to you. What do you think you see kind of between the two spaces and
Yeah,
government?
absolutely. I mean, I'd agree with many of those comments that were made. It's interesting seeing in the departments in terms of like teaching with AI. I think to my previous work at a at an undergraduate institution, and how methods were taught. And so there's really some, I think, some robust discussions happening right now whether AI should be taught as a methodology. And I think even at a fundamental level, like something like a literature review, for example. And so is it a tool that can be used in a literature review? And if so, how? And I think one of the concerns that comes up is who's doing the thinking and why. And so I think in that sort of type of work, when we engage with students and others, it's not only what tools are being used, but what we lose or might gain when we use them. And is there a an intentional awareness of that? I think it's important in that space also to recognize that's only one type of AI. So AI is really in a host of different areas. So when we use a lot of language and we mention AI, we may actually be referring to different things. And so I think as our knowledge as a field and as the field of AI really progresses, we need to start getting a little bit more specific in what we're talking about. Um, for example, in some of the work I'm doing right now in hospital settings, I mean, sure, there's chatbots and even folks using, let's say, AI for lit reviews to get up to speed very quickly. But they're also using things in, to look at maybe diagnosis. How can, if we have these huge medical data records, how can that help us maybe get ahead on the diagnostic process? And so that's a kind of a different way of thinking of AI. Or how can machine learning be used in different contexts, like maybe within an operating room? There's a lot of work really nationally looking at different parts of surgery, for example, and how might machine learning be used to help everything from analyzing X-rays to even now there's work about having AI sort of support some of the human roles. And so I think we really need to recognize that there's a huge diverse spread of work being done in AI. I'm very concerned about where the research is being supported or how the research is being supported, particularly as I look at both universities and industry. And most, for example, federal research right now funds a specific disease, let's say, or an organ system. That's a lot of what might come out of some funding places. But particularly in healthcare, the agency that funds applied research at the point of care, ARC, has been severely underfunded. So when these questions come up of how different types of AI are being used in hospital or in other clinical settings, I'm wondering who's developing that knowledge. Which industries might have access to funds to research that, and does our academic research base across the U.S. have access to the dollars to really develop the research that we need? And so I'm concerned about those. It brings in some of my political self, I think, of looking at how we might allocate resources across the U.S. But I think both understanding there's a lot of different AIs, and then there's also concerns about access to funding and research dollars. I see those as some issues that we're facing right now.
Thanks. And one of the interesting things that jumps out at me there, you talk about funding research. Um, it strikes me that particularly on AI, right, most of the really impressive research seems to be happening outside of the academy. Today it does seem like the labs, not to say that, I mean, we've always had big external labs that have done great work, but whereas in the maybe World War II era, right, the real serious science seemed to come out of um, many sort of government academic partnerships. These days, at least in AI, um, a lot of that is coming out of labs. And Kate, you sort of run a lab yourself. So, sort of any thoughts there on what you're seeing, particularly in this context of pressures on the field, but also maybe opportunities?
Sure. Thanks for that. So I'm going to just begin with Sean's disclaimer that this is my point of view and not necessarily representative of Toyota. So I want to be super clear that this is just my reflections. A couple of things. So the cheating question, I want to come back to Kieran, I think is really fascinating because I was a professor for 10 years, long before AI, and students still cheated then, right? So the bigger question, I think, fundamentally is what creates engaging work and how do we actually think about what we're trying to teach and how we're assessing that. And I think that creates a whole other opportunity for thinking about the way that AI matters and the way it's incorporated in school. And I bring this up, Matt, it is directly related to your question, because I run a team of people who are all really well experienced PhDs, but all of them cut their skills in a pre-AI work, or well, not in a pre-AI, but in some long format processes, let me put it that way. But in context also where they knew this was coming, they were like working on this. Some of them have actively been building AI systems for years. And I think when we think about preparing students to work in a lab like mine, the challenge is less about like, I think there is an opportunity for faculty to say there is value to learning the long form way of doing something because it helps you understand when is an AI system, and to Sean's point, they are very diverse, but when is an AI system not doing what it should be doing? When do you need to think differently within the system that you're engaged with? But then also, that's a different context for why to learn those skills than simply AI is bad or AI is wrong. And having an endpoint within a training system where AI becomes one of the tools that we think with and through, I think is a better way to kind of structure those training opportunities. The biggest thing, for example, that hurts my teams is I would love to hire a lot more anthropologists because honestly, the biggest thing coming forward in AI are both agents and context systems. And both of those are centrally anthropological questions, like what is the scope of agency and how do we put constraints around some of these agents? And then context systems are coming up around the question of, if I actually want to understand what you did, I need to understand the full range of what shaped a decision. And those are ostensibly where cultural anthropology plays. But if we're not in those conversations, it just becomes a hoovering of information in ways that can be very privacy problematic. I'll leave it at that. So having students who can kind of bring that thinking way into a team, I think is really the critical opportunity for anthropologists. And there's so much of this coming forward. But you have to be both willing and able to engage with AI and engage with teams that build it to be able to have those conversations. So that's why I understand like the cheating things and I understand why we want to teach foundational skills, but laddering that through to some of these bigger capabilities, I think is really a tremendous opportunity coming forward for the discipline.
Thanks. And I just want to quickly build off one thing there. So, you said something like thinking with AI. To me, I see that as maybe one of the bigger opportunities here. And then I agree with Sean, right? Broad field, lots of different tech. But across all of the tech, I actually think that AI can help you think about things. And I would almost relate it to creating a visualization, right? For some, the visualization is the sort of the end goal, but for others, creating the visualization, right, is a way to have to facilitate a conversation between people and to sort of think through the data, what they're seeing in that, should they approach it a different way? And AI, while it may not, while it may not be God mode and tell you everything you need to know exactly perfect, um, even the sort of rough edges or the inaccuracies can be kind of interesting to think with, regardless of almost what type of of AI you're speaking with here. And so, that to me gets to sort of that's like a flip where it's like a core skill of thinking about this. So instead of thinking about what does it per se give you that's an output that you can use, thinking about it as a way to sort of slow down your thinking. I reference this stuff all the time, but there's a lot of great work out of the Techno-Anthropology Lab at Aalborg University where they really sort of intentionally, right, try to use AI in this way. And so how might we, and anybody feel free to jump in or not, but does anybody have any thoughts on that and how we bring that style of thinking right into academia
Well,
and teaching?
if I may, Matt, because I loved what Kate and Sean and you have been saying about this. I did want to add, just kind of add a little asterisk to my comment that a lot of the what I had referenced to the kind of the three trends of totally accept, totally reject, and somewhere in the middle, uh, that's been a predominantly that's a U.S. response. As you mentioned, Matt, and you know very well that in parts of Europe, Northern Europe, and UK, there's a lot more engagement, active engagement, and scholarship about AI in the social sciences and anthropology. Um, and and then at the same time, just to put a broader global picture, I was talking with my colleagues in India, and I was working on that project, and I said, "So, what do the faculty think about AI?" They're like, they're terrified of it. So, you know, there's this to me, this is a really crucial moment for us to be not only thinking about the practicalities and the ethics and everything, but also the way that we can be good, what, citizens of the world or something like this, where so that we're not creating like a double or triple digital divide, that we can, share these best practices about this so that we don't create countries and pockets of people that some people know about AI and some people don't. And then what is that going to do to the already problematic state of knowledge production within and across disciplines? Um, but to your question, um, I was literally in the teaching my doctoral seminar this morning and talking to them about how we can incorporate AI, and very much it's along the lines of what you were talking about with the rough edges. So one of the things that I have them do is I will have them, it's a Anthro Theory Today course, contemporary anthropological theory. And so what I'm having them do is they're building up to basically deconstructing and reconstructing what I call representation of a theory article. So they go sentence by sentence through an article and say, what is this sentence doing as far as writing mechanics and achieving the goal of making a theoretical contribution? Stripped of all context. Like, I don't want to hear anything about hegemony and power and anything. Just what is this doing in terms of writing mechanics for accomplishing the goal? And they go sentence by sentence for an entire article. And every time I assign the students swear at me while they're doing it and thank me afterwards. But I said, now I did that, but now with AI, I'm like, well, they can just type it into AI and they can have it done. And I actually did it. So what I'm doing then is saying, you have to do, as Kate said, the long form process and go through this. And then you can type it into AI and generate something. And then you have to write a separate, like, one-page reflection about what's the difference, what's the strengths, what are the weaknesses based upon that, just so they can both get the skill and think critically about AI and see maybe there's some insights and maybe there's some hallucinations or whatever. So that's one way that I've been trying to incorporate it into uh, teaching in that sense.
If I could just follow up on that, Karen, I think I want to touch on two things. The concern among the faculty about, knowledge production. I think we have long ignored that there is already a privilege of being able to go to grad school, and particularly being able to go to grad school in anthropology, which is, 2 years of like in some ways, AI makes more possible an egalitarian understanding of the world than the traditional academic path. Because you can access knowledge that requires 10 years of your life and thousands of dollars in graduate training. But I'll stop there. As somebody who's still paying off student loans from grad school, so on that, so I think from a faculty perspective, the fear could become a curiosity of like, how is it, why is this so compelling to people? What are they doing? How are they using it? The second thing, I think theory is actually, for anyone who's read my work, so much of what I try to do is theory as a tool, not just as a lens, but how do you actually put it into play? And when we think about AI systems, particularly enterprise level AI systems that Sean and I kind of deal with a lot in our world, um, there are a lot of ways that anthropological theory would better design these kinds of systems. So, as I said, one of the biggest things right now is context systems. So, these are systems that really are trying to understand, like, how did a decision get made in an organization? And the way that they are running is by reading all of your emails and reading your Slack messages and looking across your calendar to see when you met with whom and trying to create almost a timeline in a conversation around how did a big decision get made. It's a lot of how we would do ethnography, but the consequence is this very like panopticon state at work. And one could argue, like, when you're at work, you're on work time and work computers, so they have a right to understand that. But if we set that aside, all it's, what we know from people like James Scott and all of the power theorists is that this will likely just push those conversations to another medium, and we will miss what's actually happening in an attempt to try and understand what's happening, right? So how is it that an anthropologist might design a context aware system differently than somebody who's just like, oh, there's data, we can look at data, right? Who doesn't have a perspective or a training? And what do we know about how those, how resistance happens, and where do you get collaboration and cooperation rather than creating power? How do you do power with versus power over? And that could lead to fundamentally different kinds of systems that actually do improve decision making in a company and maybe level the playing field, because all this is likely to do is create far less transparency when people figure out what's going on. So love that you're digging into theory, and I think it actually elevates, like, what is it that all of us elders know about social theory that could actually become something fundamentally different?
Thanks. I also just want to say real quick, going back to Kieran's comment, and Kate, I'm sure you're experiencing this, but like, Kieran, you were talking about sort of a divide happening across the globe, but I actually think we need to be like acknowledge that already there is a divide, in every org happening, to the point where, your largest producers who are maybe using this tech and using it well are maybe already doing 2 to 3 times as much per day, right, than people who are not doing it. And it's already creating asymmetries that, have a whole host of, potentially negative externalities, from recognition and maybe job security to, who knows what at the moment. Um, there's a lot of opportunity here, and that is probably both. I'm sure it's in higher ed as much as it is in, for-profit, nonprofit, governmental organizations. So, I just want to flag that that's not a distant future thing. I think that's already here from what I'm seeing. I don't know. Does anybody already see that in your orgs, or?
It's kind of interesting. And if I think of that sort of work, there's using AI in maybe some of those work products. Yet a lot where I work in clinical spaces, it really is this human engagement and this context, to what Kate's getting at. And so there's a interesting divide that's happening with the tools that may not necessarily be sort of a sense of who's using it for more productivity or not, but who might be using it to lead certain types of questions. So I think in the clinical space, I think of two examples, and I'll borrow a little bit from Kate there. There's one example of, let's say, an emergency department, someone's going to make a diagnosis. Maybe there's an AI tool that's designed to help them make their diagnosis faster, in a way, for example. And so that might be sort of, Matt, thinking a little bit of yours, having people having to supplement work. And so that's, the teams that might be doing that are, in a sense, completely devoid from that that emergency department nurse or doctor. They're developing tools for those clinical systems. And then there's, folks like that might be working this emergency department really to understand that context within where those tools might be applied. And I think in the emergency department, for example, There's a problem of boarding right now, which I think everyone now knows about watching The Pit, where people are getting, they go to the emergency department and they can't get beyond it. And there's this contextual knowledge that nurses and doctors have of the little tips and tricks, I call them informal expertise, to get someone admitted to a hospital. And that's something that maybe the data folks on the diagnostic process don't know, because it switches from one emergency department to another emergency department to another. And so when I think of sort of is AI being used by some departments and people are getting ahead? Absolutely, but it also depends on what we're thinking about. The work on using ED for a diagnostic process is very different than maybe some of the workflows within hospital operations. And so again, we really have to tease out where and how it's being used, because there's great variation of how people are using it, implementing it, researching it, and we almost need to add more nuance to each of these conversations. I will say one thing though, maybe to Kidan's comment, there are a lot of communities that still don't even have internet, a lot of rural communities. And so they certainly don't have access to maybe some of the LLMs if they wanted to use it at all. And so those are, I think, some very fundamental questions we really have to ask, also in terms of who's using the work and why, some of these very fundamental questions that I think we've been aware of in other arenas.
Just going to do a quick shout out, Sean. Thank you for the nuance about like it's not the AI isn't one thing. There's a lot of different systems and a lot of different ways these capabilities are integrated, and understanding particular use cases is really critical. And when I think about sort of the development of anthropology, we went from grand theory, right? Like there's this thing to all these really brilliant nuanced use cases. And I think AI will eventually, we're getting there. It's not like LLMs are going to solve everything, but we're seeing the rise of actually small language models, small behavior models that really are tailored for particular contexts and can have that richer understanding, or can have a more limited scope of we're just going to do this one thing. We're not going to try and solve the world's problems. We're going to give you just the kind of curated knowledge that you need for the thing that you're doing. And so thank you for bringing that up. Great point.
And on the point of small models, which again varies, yeah, language models a very small slice of what AI is, even though it's dominating the narrative at the moment. But particularly a small model is cheap, very cheap to run, right? So for all those who do have the concerns about costs, well, energy vis-a-vis cost, right? Uh, Small models are, a way to attack that. Nevertheless, that I think brings us into, because of the model conversation, right? It does bring us certainly into the current moment. And again, we've said, going back to the first session of these webinars, we anthropology have like an 80-year history, more or less, dealing with AI. AI is a field that has been said, as has been said today, very, very broad, two main areas, maybe symbolic and neural nets. Um, Largely over the past 20 years, it's been neural net dominated, and over the past, 5, 6 years, language model dominated, a sort of subset of neural nets. But it again is much, much broader, and there's opportunities. I work with symbolic stuff as much as I'm working with neural net stuff these days. But we are in the current moment dominated by language models. That is where most sort of the public attention goes, somewhat for good reason, maybe some misguided. Nevertheless, how, seeing as that is dominating, let's maybe just dig into that particular area for a moment and unpack the nuances Sean is saying. Like, what are we seeing there particularly? Where is the opportunity for us? Like what are you seeing in your respective spaces of right now, how we can kind of engage like with language models? Nobody want?
Um, well, yeah, this is kind of that's effectively what an empirical question I have, and I can certainly come up with an answer based upon my particular research domain. But in the going back to Kate's point about the point of what's the point of what we're teaching anthropology students and these types of assessments and this sort of thing, and I'm interested in actually studying what faculty and students do um, as a way to inform ways that we can use it. I think certainly the literature review has been talked about in here and in the literature. There have been other. I'm trying to think. I'm going to have to probably. I'm getting called if you can't hear my kids calling me in the background. So I'm going to just leave it right there and let the others two respond for a second. Please excuse me.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, you want to maybe jump in again with what you're seeing?
Sure. And how we're using language models?
Yeah, and
John?
I mean that's dominating the current moment. I think we both talk a little bit about symbolic, but large language models are hot. We're both interested, I think, in agents and what that means for the orgs. But like, how can we intervene in this current moment, which is moving very fast, maybe faster
Very,
than some
very,
people
very fast.
realize?
Yeah. Somebody put in the chat, like it's not existential, it's just change at pace. And I was like, there comes a point at which your ability to keep up can be hard. But I say that just at my point in my career. So the language models, I think, and I saw a question in the Q&A about, agents can't really replace people. The way that so at Toyota, we have a core philosophy that AI should never replace a person. It should always complement where we might struggle. And where I see the best use of the LLMs is what are helping check our own biases, for lack of a better phrase. So there's a couple of ways that we do them. One is in the ability to both process large amounts of information relatively quickly, right? So whether it's a lit review or whether it's some other, we have tons of quant data that we use. So how do we actually look at the patterns in that data? And more importantly, how do we look at patterns across data sets? So when we think about so much of ethnographic fieldwork, we have tiers of data that are all essentially time-stamped, right? Like from your field notes to a census survey to housing prices or whatever. These are time-stamped data. And what you can do is time series modeling across those multiple levels. So can you create systems that give you these sort of flows over time of the kinds of data that you have and how things are connected? It doesn't replace a good anthropologist and good thinking, but it gives you a broader perspective. Because so much of anyone who's done long-term field work, like there's a thing that you hear at field work that then can become an anchor for how you interpret the rest of what's going on. And that can sometimes be really good, but it can sometimes also close down your ability to see the broader picture of what you've got. So we use LLMs to do that. We also deliberately use LLMs to critique our own writing. So we'll draft, like we write something and then we put it to the LLM and say, what are the challenges? What are the gaps? Who, in what schools of theory would you critique this? So there's ways of doing that. We had, there was a great talk at Epic years and years ago about a theory deathmatch where you like attack an article from the perspective of different theorists. And it has long struck me that that's actually a place where LLMs could really succeed, is if you created LLMs that were hyper-trained on, and that's not a technical word, it's just my own morning word because I haven't had enough tea yet, hyper-trained on different theorists. You could put them in conversation with a data set and actually understand, all right, how would so-and-so approach this? How would a different theorist approach this topic? And expand your ability to think differently. So there's just a couple of ways that we have used them. There is a whole genre of both, as you said, symbolic AI, vision AI. They're moving more into sensory AI. We've got physical behavioral models, all kinds of stuff that I'm not really talking about, that I think could be really fascinating for the role of anthropology. Semiotics, I know for a long time, has used algorithms to look across imagery and look at patterns and opportunities within it. And then the final thing I'll say is so much of AI systems are designed around narrow, like what's the mean, but you can actually design systems that are really looking for outliers within that. And I think that would be a much more interesting use for anthropologists. So
Thanks.
I'll stop there and open it to others.
Yeah, John, I see it came off mute, so please take it. But one other thing maybe you could potentially plug here would, if interested, would be maybe governance as well, right? Because there is an opportunity for us to intervene in that way, aside from just building or using.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the key things, though, I think for anthropologists and for anyone that wants to work in this space is really to get technically literate. And I'll say that because myself, for example, over the last several years, I really started to become more aware of AI and then saying, all right, I really need the technical training. And I joke with friends and when I was taking a Python course, for example, and I said, I'm in Python kindergarten right now. But it was absolutely necessary. And to take some of those those first courses and steps that I hadn't had before. And then from there, there's opportunities with different fellowships with NIH and a lot of free courses even out there, and universities increasingly are holding day-long workshops. I think when the University of Florida had a day-long program for students. One of the comments in here, I think, was talking about differences in cohorts in the skills. And so there's, I think, a lot of opportunities for individuals to become more aware with the technology and to try things out. It's wonderful to learn by doing. And when we do this sort of engagement, when we're actually part of the teams in the room, I think we can actually figure out ways that we can engage as anthropologists. And so we shift a little bit from some of the sort of more blanket concerns we may have to being more technical. And we can start to say, all right, how can our anthropological ideas and methods be brought in to start looking at, I don't know, doctor's notes in the comments in a certain way? And then, we can start to say, and what might be some of those privacy concerns with the way the models might be developed. And as we think of things like, governance and regulation of these, we can start to get a little bit more technical and say, all right, what safeguards might need to be put in place in here. And I think, Matt, at the last session, you said for individuals, use a paid version and change some of the privacy settings. Like that's a very fundamental level, let alone if we shift to sort of the national level. We do have, I think, opportunities to think of who's as these models are developed, who's controlling these and what knowledges are in them, and that might be an anthropological question to ask. There's a fundamental tool in place in each of these different models that are steering however they're in the second round maybe manipulated. They're steering the way we view the world or analyze the world in certain directions. And I think, as anthropologists, as we use these tools, and if we're working in areas of governance and policy, we need to understand some of the technical aspects and then can ask questions of, hey, if I use this tool, this model versus this model, what's it going to mean in terms of the output that the user experiences? And those are some technical questions, but I think they're the type of questions that anthropologists like to ask. But we need that tech skill, that at least that engagement and ability to, at a minimum, talk with others in this space. So I'd encourage anyone to jump on, set some time in your calendar for regular coursework, if not engaging in one of these national programs to give you a crash course.
Thanks. And and Kieran, I'll come to in just a second. Somebody put in a question because I used the word governance. So I guess what I mean there, real quick, is so many people think, like at least from an outside of the academy perspective, that you need to work in UX research or you need to work in a lab like Kate. You know, um, those are great jobs, of course, or can be. But there are plenty of other jobs. I work in product management. You could work in some kind of policy role, and there actually are a lot of policy fellowships, paid fellowships all over the world right now for AI, whether it's, sort of ethical AI, transparency in AI, machine interpretability, all kinds of stuff that would be all kinds of subject matter areas that would be of interest probably to many people on the call. I don't have a list of those, so like I can't necessarily like provide them. But point is there's actually a lot of ways for us to intervene, say like outside, and I'm sure there's a lot of ways to intervene in the academy in terms of teaching, training, running faculty workshops, leading policy initiatives in academic organizations that set the guidelines around the use and transparency thereof. etc. But Kieran, let me come to you because you came off mute.
Yeah, no, I was just going to thank you. And I'm, I know I'm supposed to be a presenter, but I'm also just like, I love what you all are saying. So great. Um, and Sean, I loved that you were mentioning basically to echo what was mentioned in a previous webinar, that basically trying to play with things. Uh, just kind of, we're not going to break it. Um, Despite any Luddite tendencies someone may have. We're not going to break AI. So playing with it is perfectly fine. So just trying to play around, and that's effectively to get back to the question about how we can work with LLMs to, in a sense, uh, that's when I was putting together a grant proposal, that's what I did. I just got onto three different, I got onto Claude, I think Copilot and Gemini or something, and said, I need to design a research question about that looks at these three things. And then I put that in there and generated like 15 different versions and then looked at it and then thought about, okay, well, this doesn't work, this element doesn't work, and did my own sort of internal process of reading and developing it. And that was using that. So just a kind of brainstorm, but I was playing to the point. And I think that's really important. Also, the importance of upskilling, which I'm in the process of doing right now as well, is really an important element of this. And Kate's mention of revisiting how earlier interpretations of our data can kind of shape and limit put blinders on us theoretically. I'm reminded of the work of Jean Lave in her book on apprenticeship, where she basically revisits her work from the 1970s and says, oops, I missed this, you know? So there's a way to even maybe use our own data and kind of go back and say, hey, well, what did we miss? As another way of approaching it. And the last point I'll make here before giving back is this is all, again, Sean kind of pointed at an earlier point from an earlier webinar about how, we can think about this AI as there's multiple AIs, right? And computer vision and all sorts of things and whatnot, but think of it as a cultural object, a cultural artifact, and then thinking of it as a tool, as someone I think mentioned in the chat, and as we can think about, and that's what I want to do research on, is what are faculty doing, germane to a panel that's going to be at the SFAAs on licensure and the sort of requisite skills of being an applied anthropologist. What are we doing, and how can we use AI to make this different and provide other information? And lastly, to get a anthropology, as Kate and Sean have been mentioning, to intervene on the development of these things. So those sort of three things that Matt's written about as well. So
If I could there was a question in the chat about the growing divide among grad students between those who engage with AI and those who are staunchly anti-AI. Um, it reminded me of when I left academia to take a job in industry. And the vitriol I faced from a lot of my colleagues. At the same time, I was teaching 6 classes with a couple hundred students and making $22,000 a year. So we could talk about which systems are abusive or not, but I'll just pause there for the moment. The tent is big. We will always need people who are there challenging the power systems and looking at the consequences and the real harms that AI and systems can do to communities and can do to people who are underrepresented in data sets and who are left out of the conversations or who don't have access because they don't even have internet. Like, let's start with some very fundamental things. I am 1,000% behind funding and continuation of that work, because what that also does is then for those who have the appetite and the willingness and the desire to change the systems, they can take those ethnographies and figure out, how do I get into a Microsoft or an Intel or an OpenAI or a whatever, and actually start to rework these systems to be less abusive, to be smaller, to have more affordable, less water intensive. Pick your thing. Like, you can then, for those who opt to go into industry, the potential for change is scalable part of what I love about being at Toyota is we are a company of 500,000 people across the globe. If I can change the way that some of these things happen, if my team can do that, we impact not just those 500,000, but their families, their communities, and everything around them. That is anthropology's greatest superpower. If that's not where you want to be, that's totally fine. Continue to do the great work that my team can then go, here's this problem space that we've got to fix. So that, I think these should remain a conversation. And if the less we fight with each other and the more we learn with each other, that's ultimately the power of the discipline. Like, could we just stop the yelling and work together to actually build some human systems that can do great things?
Meant to give you a thumbs up to that, but or a clap. I didn't mean to raise my hand, but yeah, right on. Um, Before maybe pivoting a bit, anybody else would just want to weigh in there? Okay. So, we started by saying disciplinary pressure, and we kind of like got right into that. But I almost, and we got pretty far down the rabbit hole, but I want to sort of zoom back out to that for a second. Maybe not everybody agrees with me here, but I think some of the pressure, right, we said sort of there's a lot of existential stuff type stuff going on. But one of the pressures that I see is from data science and fields like data science and business, or now AI proper sort of academic programs that are increasingly getting greater headcounts and thus funding, the graduating students that get good jobs. And so, part of, I think, in my worldview, part of the pressure is the fact that we're not necessarily graduating enough students who go out and get absolutely killer jobs, um, who can that we can point to and say, like, look at this person. They don't turn around necessarily and donate back as much, maybe. I'm painting with a pretty broad brushstroke there. But, when you look at like MBA programs, they're often the cash cow for universities. So is there anything that we might be able to learn from other programs to make sure that, we are organizing our programs that way to sort of fight off this competition? But also maybe training in similar ways. Like I've said it before, I said at the end of last class, but like in business, right? I always had to give presentations every class. I make my students in business programs give presentations, and so they come out fairly seasoned at like talking in front of groups. Any thoughts on what we can pick and choose from other programs around us? Maybe it's because you've hired people that have these skills, or you've seen it in higher ed itself.
Maybe I'll start us off. One thing anthropologists still, I think, for the most part, I'll say, broad statement, broad brush, train the individual researcher, the individual anthropologist, and then the minute someone leaves their institution, they're no longer the individual researcher because the questions are too big. Or the timelines are too fast, whether someone goes into, whether they go into government, into industry, wherever they may be. We work in teams. And so there are increasingly, I think, at the undergraduate and graduate level, we train individuals. Increasingly, we're seeing the utility of teaching skills together and in groups of people. But I think that sort of training needs to change. And I see that with some individuals that I've worked with that are recent graduates. Some of those that might come from programs where they are the individual. They have trouble working with others and or engaging with different knowledges. And so, we need to come out of our disciplines as maybe anthro plus. And so we have our anthro skills plus these other skills we have in working with others so that we can join these complex teams and not necessarily understand that knowledge, but know how to work with that knowledge in a way that's useful. So I guess I maybe said two things there. We need to get away from the individual-oriented training model, and we also need to teach individuals how to work with other disciplines. And that I see as a something that's challenging the discipline and would be an immense use in this field. I, for example, are working with some phenomenal individuals that have technical skills that far outweigh mine. One of my plus skills is knowing how to convene or find the right people and put them together to develop some sort of an idea. If there's a lot I don't know, and I think it's a strength to be able to say that and then to find the right person that does and know how to work with them. And I don't think we're doing enough of that in anthropology programs. Maybe I'll kick off a little bit that way. It almost steered away from AI, a little bit broader there, but I think that is a good beginning. There's a host of other things to talk about for sure.
If I could just follow up on that quickly, 100% to the teamwork, 100% to humility over your own skills, but your ability to see the system. Honestly, the biggest thing that some of my team members struggle with is the critique mindset. When you are part of a team, your job is not to destroy your team members and poke holes in their arguments. It is very much a like, interesting. How do we learn together? And to me, the core skill of anthropology is endless curiosity of, how does that make sense to that person? Why did they do that? What's going on there? All of that questioning, but from a place of engagement, not from a place of bitterness. And the people who have struggled most in our organization they just launch at their colleagues and it is unpleasant and they don't make it. And so really training people, that doesn't mean that you don't call out problems. And it doesn't mean that we tolerate like mediocre work, but you do it in a different way. So yes, to like, how do we play nicely with others? And I will fully own, I have blown up jobs in the past by being that person and not understanding how the corporate world worked. So 100% plus to that, Sean. The other thing I think, we have an extraordinary range of methods that our discipline uses, and getting people to practice them and then reflect on what was this good for? What was it not good for? What did I learn from it? What did I not learn from it? I think is the mindset that we need when it comes to thinking creatively about what the possibilities are in an AI assisted world. Because AI it's kind of another tool. It's like a whole darn toolkit, but it's more that creative thinking of these kinds of things lead to this kind of information. And that mindset, or what at Toyota we call it a thinking way, I think allows you then to play with any toolkit creatively and differently and break and reassemble and pull stuff together in ways that others wouldn't. And so I would lean heavily into very applied methods training, but then the reflection that comes on the heels of that.
I I echo what Sean and Kate have been mentioning here. I've in one of the modules I was teaching a few weeks ago, we were reading the work of Anthony Firmin, who was the Haitian anthropologist from the 19th century. And he talks about then if you're going to be an anthropologist, you need to be, knowledgeable about all of these different fields like biology and botany and all these other things. And I bring that up to my students, like if you're going to be an anthropologist, it's just not about some sort of Boasian canon, right? That's not it, right? It is this intellectual curiosity, as Kate brought up. Um, and I think the sort of, you know, the big picture, broad systems thinking is something that's really important. And as far as to Matt's question about how do we think about training and learn from examples of other programs, I was reading an article that a lot of business or a lot of computer science programs are there's a decline in the number of applications to them, even though there's been an uptick in school applications because they didn't have AI, they were not AI focused. And so those programs lost applications versus those that had like the new, AI focused programs had an uptick. So I think what we can learn from this and when it comes to training is that we need to recognize that this is a thing and this is a tool. And it's not going to ruin our spelling like spell check or anything like this, but it's a tool, and that we can, if we learn how to play with it, we can actually maybe use our intellectual curiosity and play and actually really come up with some interesting things, either for our individualized tenure track type research or for other, team-oriented projects. And I think that absolutely about teamwork, but also there needs to be something about, if and how can what was I thinking of the term? Something like uh, it has something to do with leadership as well. Because even if you're working by yourself, you're going to be working with other people. So there's a degree to which we have to think about, how do you actually do your work in a conscientious and humanist way? Um, and it's not exactly from another project, but I think it's an important thing for when we're training anthropologists. How do you play with others, but how do you also manage your own time and your own well-being as a holistic person as well? So,
Okay, to
Exactly.
figure that out, can you write that book, please? Sorry.
No, no, oh, good. Well, so I just wanted to build on that because in previous sessions, it's not that we ignored sort of the ethics topic. We certainly got on it, but we never made it like a sort of a dedicated topic because I was sort of almost, very much like an academic paper building up to it. It always seems to come at the end, and this is the end of the close to the end of the webinars prior to the conference. And so, I did want to get into that today. Themes that have come up many times before, like, impact to labor, accelerationism, uh, environmental concerns. Kieran, you mentioned today, like intellectual property, right? And so, a lot of these have come up before, and we would give on the previous two webinars, we often, would often touch on them, but I wanted to make sure that we kind of dug into a few today and a little bit more. And so, to begin with, I guess seeing as we do have many people still who will be coming out of the academic context and are very worried about all this in the academic context, let's maybe just start there. Kuhn, you already mentioned sort of writing, publishing, right, intellectual property, the fact that maybe models have been trained on other intellectual property. Um, what are you seeing? What are people talking about? If you could just maybe unpack all of that a little bit more.
well, I think there's to think about um, ethics and use. One of the things that I think is not being brought up enough, or just kind of like hinted at and then dropped within the academic setting, is why are people doing it? If they're using AI in unethical ways, why are they doing it? And I can think of a couple of different cases, and what other students have anecdotally told me is that it has to do with the nature of university studies and perhaps, I don't know, at faculty level, this push towards trying to be as efficient as possible and do as much as possible and just run, 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 run. And I think there's something about going back to the book that I was going to write for Kate about the work-life balance, where there's something which is putting so much pressure on students and perhaps faculty to make them produce more and more and more, that says, well, here's a shortcut. I can do this and maybe I'll get away with it. And that's happened with, actually, I now think about it, that's happened with scholars trying to publish things too. So, we can talk about the ethical uses and the problems and pitfalls and opportunities, but the anthropologist is saying, but let's look at this larger context as well, rather than just punishing the individual for doing something.
Go ahead, Sean.
When a couple things come to mind when I think of ethics, and I'm fortunate enough to work with some human factors engineers, and in in there's a lot of different methods, a lot of different ways in seeing the world, a very similar curiosity. And I'm constantly reminded when I work with them of looking at the entire system, which is something in many ways that anthropologists do. We look at this broader context. And so I think of Kate's comments early on saying it's a big tent. And I think all of the ethical concerns that are brought up are very real and legitimate in cases. And we need folks to examine those and think about those and share them. So in many ways, the impact of, let's say, centers on communities, data centers on communities and water, those are important questions to look at and think about. And an anthropologist working in the field is in a wonderful position really to examine these sorts of questions. At the same time, an anthropologist working in clinical settings also has an opportunity to look at how things like, to borrow from the Doris Duke Foundation, looking at clinical algorithms and maybe how ideas about race are actually impacting clinical algorithms. So we have a range of, as with really anything coming up, we have any technology. We have a range of needs, and I think it's important for us to look at those and consider them. I tend to be more of the optimistic individual and say, let's engage these, and can we make them more ethical and make them better. There is a tremendous utility here. Can we grapple with these very difficult ethical questions and make something better out of them? But we need folks to look at that entire system and push beyond it and say, what are some of the further impacts that maybe we're not aware of when we need to think about? And anthropologists are great at doing that particular work.
I'll just so my dissertation work was in the field of child abuse. And so for the better part of almost 2 decades between the research and the teaching, I spent a lot of my life listening to people talk about why the choices they made that impacted their family happened. And so, and all of them were perfectly reasonable to those people as to what was going on. And the question of ethics, I think, is critical. Let me be careful, but also very, very slippery. Jerome Bruner, who's a political anthropology, political psych, notes that often values become just an easy way of anchoring a wide range of behaviors, which is how you can have freedom as a justification for book banning, and all of these things. So as we get into ethics, I would encourage us to potentially think about what is it that we're actually trying to do. So the systems dynamics, I think, are a much better way in some ways of framing a conversation that can get very political very quickly. But who is impacted? What are the consequences? What is the scale and degree of these impacts? And are these things that can be undone, and how quickly could they be undone? Those, to me, in terms of looking at impact, are almost probably more likely to get traction than if we go in and talk about fairness or ethics. And I say this having spent so much of my career in systems where people fundamentally believed that what they were doing was absolutely the right and good thing to do. And everybody on the outside looking at it and going and being horrified. So I'm not saying this is like a corporate shell per se, but like having worked in areas where people have wildly different opinions about what is happening. And so from an ethics perspective, I think the more we can focus the language around impact and consequences and risks, I actually think we have a far better way of doing that. And to me, that's also a fundamentally anthropological way of framing a conversation that kind of avoids the language of the inherent judgment, even if it's coming from an internal place of judgment all the time. So I just wanted to kind of give that slight nuance to that, and I'll put myself on mute now.
Thanks for that. So, one last thing I'd like to maybe touch on, and then maybe we'll look at questions. One of the things that is happening fast is agentic AI, which is very much grounded in language model, or at least the modern paradigm is grounded in language models, but multi-agent systems have been around a long time. So the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of the ethics space is that I, from somebody who's, involved in the field in an applied context, I see it moving very fast, you know, like faster than I expected. And yes, it's moving most swiftly in spaces like coding, but that's rapidly translating to having impact in other knowledge work. And I don't think there's much work yet out there from what I've looked at. I'm thinking about agents and teaming and how that fits into an organizational context and what the impact of all that is. So one, I'm basically throwing out to say that I think it's a space folks should get in on, including myself. I'd love to partner with people, but is anybody like Katie? I mean, maybe I'll come back to you. Are you seeing anything happening in that space that, or are you thinking about, agentic in your workplace? And I know you're not representing Toyota today, but that, we should bring forward and get people thinking about, because it seems like a place we need to get in on quick.
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, there's a couple, yes, we're absolutely building agentic systems, but a lot of our conversation is around how do you do that? Like, what is the way to design so we deal with essentially social dynamics and complex emergent systems, right? So how do you think about what an agent can do? And this gets us foundationally to these old conversations about structure and agency, right? What is this and what are we tagging off? And what are the constraints that need to be put on these? And how do we know when and how they're performing? So we, for example, the platform that my team is working on right now has no decision-making ability. It can't actually do anything. It can tee up information from a wide range of perspectives, but it can't actually make decisions. And we've put those in as guardrails. Another thing is it never reports out on individual people. The smallest thing it can report out on is a division, like a team. So we're never so we're building in the structure around how we want our agents to perform. I'm not seeing, and I think that part of what there is a lot of open opportunity to really think about the concept of agency and a lot of opportunity to think about what are we offloading and what are the consequences. There's great work, great parallel work in anthropology on things like caretaking and housekeeping and, all of these things about what changes when fundamental tasks get performed by someone else. But certainly my team is working on this and we have a couple things coming out soon, but it's a big open space and I would strongly encourage more people to get involved. So yeah, does that answer your question, Matt? Sorry, I feel like I
No. Yep. These are emerging areas. There is no right or wrong here.
But no, I'm not seeing any really good thinking in terms of when can you set up a coding agent and when do you set up an agent that is, managing your workforce. Very different scale and scope of responsibility. So for sure, let's do more of that.
Great. Anybody else possibly want to weigh in on that, or otherwise maybe we can go to some questions from the group? All right. So everybody here, feel free. If there's one that you particularly see that you want to jump in on, happy to have folks just weigh in. And everybody out there, please feel free to post something in the Q&A. Just trying to read through these real quick. There was an earlier coming back to, and Kate, you kind of touched on this, but somebody mentioned like productivity and the pace earlier, and I did respond, right? But and I know we had a little conversation on that, right? But I think there's maybe a question here of is it only about moving faster, right? Is it about potentially even increasing the quality? And even if we are doing more, is that necessarily bad if maybe our effort is not necessarily increased, like if we're just actually getting more done? Anybody just have any thoughts on that? Because I kind of answered and it went
Y-
away.
I had a funny situation last week where I was working on a project and I was getting ready to analyze some data, and I said, oh, you know what? I've got a little closed system right here. Why don't I see what I can do with this? And I was just astounded by how quickly it did this. I put in a pretty complex, had a complex conversation for a prompt and multiple, it was a pretty very complex task and that I wanted, and I was incredibly surprised by how um, not only how quickly it was accomplished, but also uh, potential next steps. And it was I'd done something similar a couple of years ago, and it was just a complete mess. The result was, I mean, it was just incredible how different it was. And so I sent that bit of information off to a team, a member of the team, and I said, here's some content, here's all the code that I used, we can have a discussion about this and can still, sort of do the long format, the manual. And I was just it it allowed me then to shift to something else. And we'll come back to this work, but I think of sort of the doing. I'm reminded, what's our goal? What is the goal that we want to achieve? And I had to think a little bit about looking at this content that was produced, and I went, this will help me in the goal of this project I'm doing in healthcare. It'll get me closer to that. And it wasn't a groundbreaking step, but it was enough where I just freed up probably a day, which is kind of significant. And so I don't know. I think of the doing and the such. We got to remember, what's our goal, and are these tools going to help us get there? And sometimes that's a good thing. There are some things that I wouldn't have appreciated the analysis of, but in this one it was fine. Maybe that's a little bit of something to throw in there. I don't know if folks have more to say or think about that.
Well, I'll tie that to Kieran's book that I need him to write for me, which is that there's a new study that came out about using a lot of the agentic coding tools. And what they find is that it actually ups the bar for what should get done. So now the panic is like, I need to set an agent to go do something, and then I'm going to go to this meeting, and then when I come back it'll be done and I can review it, and then before my next meeting I need to set my agent to do something else. And almost this sort of like manager of agents burden that is sort of driving massive productivity gains. It works for certain kinds of things. Let me also be very clear about that. Like, but it is interesting to see that the mindset isn't now like, oh, I have a day back. Like, what else could I do? It's I have all of now that there is more potential, there is more expectation. The bar has just gotten higher and higher for teams. So Kieran, please work on how we manage well-being across this. I did want to, if it's okay, I want to pick up one of the questions that was in the thread around sort of an open sourcing of anthropological knowledge. I have laughed for years, like, wouldn't it be awesome if we could put some like if the human relations area file were actually like an AI database where we could search and find patterns and do sorts of things. I have for years relied on the annual review articles and all of those sorts of things, and fully believe, subscription, license, all of those things. But again, I'm in a position where I have either been able or willing to pay for those access. But what happens when open access also means that that information is then not included as part of these thinking tools, and whose voices are being left out, and how do we think about that? But at the same time, how do we recognize the value of labor and the importance of that thinking and balance that? So I don't have an answer, Michael. I think it was your question. But absolutely, I think these are some of the pivotal questions that we need to think about with the whole publication model of both the financial compensation for all of the people who have done the hard work of thinking, but also the accessibility of how that comes forward, for people who, I do think the job market will destabilize significantly over the next decade, and costs will become an issue for a lot of things. Um, so yeah, so just plus oneing that it's a great conversation that needs to happen across the whole of the discipline. But I think that just locking stuff up doesn't necessarily solve the challenge. If anything, it makes, Matt, to your business school case, like it makes our information sort of less valuable, because it's not getting integrated, not getting shared, not getting explored.
Yeah, just a few quick responses to that. So, like, Wikidata, invisible infrastructure of the internet, in December, only 5,000-ish of the 90,000 articles from AAA ever were in Wikidata in terms of bibliographic data. We are terribly invisible, and so we also aren't very present, in many of the systems that invisible infrastructure that sort of surfaces knowledge, search engines, and now large language models. And so there actually is, there needs to be a concerted effort amongst all of us to address that. And I know some people are against having their content in these, but at least to, I again think it's locking it up in a way that makes us further invisible in the future. Also, Kate, I want to say that I suppose in a work context, maybe there's an expectation, if you're running agents that it's about productivity and being asked to do more. But I would also say that don't discount this on your own time to delight you. I mean, I have literally right now three agents are running at a screen in front of me, all working on three separate projects for me. And I am building things that are completely delightful to myself and I mean, I actually went and backfilled the whole Wikidata catalog or the whole catalog of AAA in Wikidata because I was able to build tools to go and source all the information and populate it, right? Like these are the kind of things that we can do now that would have taken a long time in the past, and now they've become week to week projects.
I have
So,
a little chat GPT buddy, that I've overtrained on Gregory Bateson's work, who yells at me all the time and helps me be a better thinker.
great. So we're gonna try to wrap up in about 7 or so minutes here, 8 minutes. So, again, if anybody has any questions they want to particularly attend to, we have a lot of comments, not a lot of direct questions necessarily. Anna, we are reply to you. We are still going there. You may have a mute, an audio issue on your end.
If I could just talk a little bit about the publication and productivity crunch and will there be increased expectations in academics? Um, I'm just remembering when I was having conversations with some Ghanaian colleagues that were on postdocs at my university, and they were given support to come to the university for like 3 months to work on up in the writing. And so I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And then they said, yeah, I'm working on 5 articles right now. I'm like, 5 articles in 3 months? And they're, yeah, because if we want to get a job or get tenure, we need to have like 20 or 30 articles. I'm like, excuse me? Like I'm like, how can you, that just seems inhuman. And this is cultural anthropology. This is not biological anthropology. Okay, maybe. If you ever saw Paul Farmer's, CV, then you can understand. He's got 75 pages, fine. But I'm like, how are you doing that? He said, so I question like where it's being published. Does it pay to publish all these sorts of things? So I think to go back, are we, I'm in an R1 university. Are we going to be expected to be more productive now and having more articles? Um, and quite honestly, I don't think so. I think there's going to be a different pressure. And I think the pressure is going to be more about the relevance to market. And AI, I think, will be, the ability to integrate AI in a reasoned manner, for the big picture. Why are we doing this? That Kate and Sean had pointed out. Why are we training anthropologists for what? What are some fundamentals that are a part of anthropology? I think departments that aren't, oriented that way are going to feel pressure. I think they're going to, they may not get the same, particularly if they're public institutions. they're not going to get the same amount of pressure or the same amount of support. They'll feel the pressure to say, oh, well, then who are you graduating? What's your, in Florida, they love to fetishize this notion of, what do you do right after graduation? Well, that model doesn't fit every single field. And as anyone knows, your undergraduate degree has very little to do with, what you can do after you graduate. Um, so I think that, it's not going to be the productivity of an individual scholar, but it's going to be even program and college wide that there's going to be some issues about efficiency and productivity.
Great. So we do need to wrap up. And maybe ask, if everybody wants to give one last sort of thought. Again, we're kind of thinking of the future, thinking of disciplinary pressures, anything you want to leave folks with that maybe I didn't ask, or and then we'll wrap up by mentioning the stuff at the annual meeting. So
I'll kick off. I came into anthropology at a moment when it was fundamentally about curiosity and joy and really looking at the world through other people's eyes. I chose the darkest topics ever, but like that was the core of the discipline. And I think for any business going forward, somebody who can think widely and critically and be resilient in how they address a problem will be the very team members we want in companies of all sizes. And the more that we can instill that, go back to that idea of here's theorists and methods, and they can all answer a wide range of questions. That will be the very people who can survive and thrive in the coming world of work. And so I would just really lean into kind of the openness that is the discipline, that allows us to interrogate questions from 20 different perspectives, because you back that with some of those actual skills that Sean was talking about, and you've created a really superhuman team member who can, and who, no matter what AI is out there, that's the person who will be able to understand and make sense of it.
Sean, how do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think maybe one takeaway is to remember that anthropologists navigate places, and we have different ideas and perspectives in what we see around us. And it may include things like AI and other technologies. It may include the humans. It may include the context. And we need to get into those spaces. We need to, oh, hello there. We need to get into those spaces, and we need to engage with others in the technologies. And some of these are new. I'm I guess mid-career-ish, and I'm engaging in this space. It is fun, to speak to Kate's point, it is fun to get in these spaces. So we need to get out. Some of them may be new and uncomfortable for us, but we need to engage in them. And with the others doing the work in that space, and to remember the endpoint, perhaps if we're applied anthropologists, is what we're trying to address, what we're trying to work on. If it's in healthcare, perhaps it's safety, and it's those family members in the waiting room hoping that their family member comes out safe. And so we need to use the tools and the people we can to make that outcome better.
Thanks.
And try and get my comments as much as I can while I'm being bombarded by twin one. So I think that with AI and anthropology, I think there, as it's been hinted at in comments and questions, and that I think there's going to be a watershed. This is a watershed. There are going to be students and faculty who don't want to be involved, and those that do. There are going to be people who get involved with it and people who don't earlier. Rather, I think eventually it's going to be, I think everyone will be, I mean, we are all involved in AI almost every day, no matter what, if you're doing a basic Google search or whatever. So I think there are going to be these schisms. And I think to people who are on this side of the digital divide, or people who are in departments or that where there's antipathy towards being involved. we should know that there are people out there who are willing to talk and support, and there are free opportunities. And so I'm trying to end on a hopeful note that the, that this is, I think this offers some real promise for the future. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks. And I'll just quickly build on that hopeful note that while there are challenges that our discipline will face, that we may face as individuals, the discipline, organizations, countries, etc., there is also an opportunity to get in and shape this. And we're at the somewhat close-ish to the outset of a new paradigm in AI that is rapidly, it's moving very quick. So it's another time to get involved, as it was when previous anthropologists got involved in the 2000s around, big data and machine learning and expert systems in the 80s and 90s and linguistic symbolic systems in the 60s and 70s, right? So now's another moment to kind of continue that tradition, and it is exciting work. Uh, there is new work that needs to be done, theoretical, methodological, and so would encourage everybody to get involved. And it can be a pretty exciting space to be working in right now. And so if you're going to the annual meeting, again, there are two workshops. There's sort of we have like a basic workshop and an advanced workshop. Basic is very much kind of chatbot related. The advanced one will go beyond those, getting into some environments that are more data science like. There are multiple panels, both organized by Kieran and I and others. We have started a new AI TIG, Kieran and I, and so there are some that are related to that and the grant that is funding all of this. There are others that are maybe from the business TIG or others, other TIGs. And so do check out the program. Certainly check out, if you're looking for the ones that we're engaged in, you could search Kieran's name, my name. You'll find us somehow kind of connected to many of these. You can reach out to us. Happy to chat. And again, this video will go up on Society for Applied Anthropology's YouTube channel. Let me try to get that real quick. But check for there probably in a few days. And again, reach out should you have any questions. YouTube link coming. We'd be happy to chat offline and definitely look for the webinars after the annual meeting as well. So thank you all for attending. Appreciate everybody showing up today. And thank you to Kate, Kieran, and Sean.
Thank you to all of you.
Thanks,
Yay.
everyone.
Keep it going. Really good to see everyone.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Actually, Kieran, if you have like 5 minutes, I just want to chat with you.